Hi guys, so in this video I'm going to be talking through my first impressions of the DJI RS3 Mini gimbal. It's their latest gimbal, very small, very lightweight, and for a wedding videographer who's often carrying loads of equipment around, I have been quite keen to upgrade my gimbal for a couple of years now, but there never seemed to be the right one for me in terms of the potential benefits that it could bring until this one was released. And the old gimbal I used was the Ronin-S, and I had two side handles on it to allow me to do my parallax shots a little bit easier. I think that wider base meant it was easier to control the parallax effect, but in doing so and having those handles on, it meant it was a much bigger setup, much heavier, and took up much more space. The other benefit of having the side handles was it gave you different mounting points for accessories, and there's been one or two other wee tricks I've done in the past, but with 4K 50 FPS on the Sony a7 IVs now, I didn't need one of those tricks. So one thing I do like to do on my gimbal is pop a Zoom H1 on it somewhere to be able to get a little bit better quality of audio for times when you're relying on the audio from the gimbal camera. Things like a first look between the bride and her dad is a good example, or a confetti shot. And I don't like putting a shotgun mic on top of the camera because, again, it adds to the space that the camera takes up. I'm not comfortable throwing a camera in the bag that has a shotgun mic on top of it, so that's why I tend to go with the Zoom as that audio option. So any new gimbal I was getting, I wanted to make sure it could have a mounting point for a microphone, a Zoom H1, and I had to buy an accessory, but I did get an accessory from Small Rig that slots into the side of the RS Mini 3, and that works pretty well. I've had to be a little bit clever with the angle and the positioning of the Zoom H1, because depending on how you pan and tilt the camera when it's on the gimbal, it could knock into the Zoom H1 that's attached on the side there. So it's one that I'm going to have to be a little bit careful with as I use it, but I think that is a major hurdle that I was worried about with changing gimbal that is overcome, and I'm going to be quite happy with that setup, I believe. The gimbal itself, the main benefit here, and it is a huge benefit, is it is so light compared to the Ronin-S. Makes a massive difference when you're holding it. I've actually been moving away from using the gimbal much at weddings, so I typically use it for bride's first look with her dad, bride walking down the aisle, possibly signing the register, and the couple then walking up the aisle, confetti shot, and possibly usually the first dance as well. I sometimes use it a wee bit for couple shoots, but I've been moving more to a one camera setup for this with a 16-55 Sony lens, just to give me quicker scope for getting tights, mediums, and wides, because photographers tend to work quite quickly, and if I'm putting a gimbal down, picking a camera up handheld, it's you can often miss shots in that fast-paced environment, so I'm leaning towards using the Zoom at that point. So that reduction in weight is probably the main benefit and the biggest benefit for having this gimbal. Also, at a couple of weddings I've got coming up, I am hired for dual coverage or hybrid coverage, so I'm going to have the gimbal in one hand at those moments and a photography camera in the other hand. And having that lightweight is going to make such a difference to being able to cope with those moments of the day, particularly the first dance, because you can be holding that up for 3 to 4 minutes, sometimes a bit longer if you've got the cake cut in there before the first dance as well. And I've done that once or twice with the the Ronin-S, and it is fairly taxing on your arms. So that's going to be great for saving my arms a wee bit at those moments of the day where I'm doing both. There are a couple of negatives that I've experienced so far with RS Mini 3. One being that the mounting plate that goes on is different to the mounting plates I use for my cameras for my tripods. I use one of the Manfrotto quick release plates, and typically what I've done with previous gimbals is I have attached the DJI's plate to a quick release plate for the Manfrotto plate that I have on my camera, and mount it onto the quick release plate for the gimbal. And this means it's easy to switch between using that camera as a gimbal camera or using it for tripod work, which sometimes I'll have jobs that I'm not using the gimbal at, so it's handy to have the quick release plate that is applicable to both. But with the RS Mini 3, I found that you can't, maybe you can, but I couldn't get the camera to balance with the Manfrotto quick release plate attached onto the DJI plate to fit into the gimbal lock. It put the camera too high up, and it meant it couldn't balance in that tilt axis, which was really annoying because although you could just put the DJI one straight onto your camera and that would work perfectly, that then limited that camera for being able to work with my tripods. And if I was ever going to use the gimbal camera on a tripod, I would need to change the plate on the bottom of the camera. So what I ended up doing was a bit extreme, but I've ended up buying another A7 IV that is now going to be solely dedicated to being my gimbal camera. And I was looking at getting a new camera anyway because of the dual coverage weddings that I've got coming up. I wanted a dedicated gimbal camera that was going to stay on the gimbal all day, and I didn't need to faff around picking it off, attaching it to my hip, going into photos, and then going back to video sort of thing. So that was always in the plans anyway, but that plate issue just sort of convinced me, yeah, that's what I need to do. But worth pointing that out, that was a bit of an issue for me. The RS Mini 3 has a wee touch screen on it that is pretty cool. It's not a major benefit for me because I don't really use it. Once I've got my preferred settings, I'll tend to stay in that mode for any wedding videography that I do. I don't really use the gimbal too much outside of weddings, so I'm sticking to one setting and staying with it. But the screen does work very well. It's very responsive. It picks up your touch very easily, and it's very quick. So if you were worried about the screen, it's great. It's nothing to worry about. The other main negative I've found, although I've kind of got around it now, is the way that the different speed settings work on the RS Mini 3. So usually for wedding videos, I would be in preference of a slower mode in terms of getting smooth pans, smooth turns, and not too much jaggedy quick changes. So I started off using the slower movement settings, but I found that there's a bit of a delay. It's almost like a lag rather than the speed of it actually slowing down. And I was having a play around with it, and I found it really hard to get consistency with, in terms of it almost doesn't start turning until you've got to a certain point and you stop turning it, and then it starts to move around. So I wasn't sure how I felt about this, but what I've ended up doing is moving up to the fast movement settings, and with that, it does respond almost instantly to your turn. So all I'll have to do is just move a little bit slower when I'm doing any parallaxes or any turns and tilts, and I can get that smooth motion. But this was something that was a little bit disappointing as well, as it's not quite like how the Ronin-S was in terms of its pans and tilts. Another minor negative, and it's very minor because I'm probably not going to use this feature either, but one of the things I thought was going to be a fair benefit to this was the locking switches on the different axes. And I thought for travel, being able to lock that movement off of the gimbal, I thought might have been a big benefit. Sorry if you can hear that drilling in the background. The neighbour's got some work going on. I thought that was going to be a big benefit, being able to lock the axes in place, especially for moving around with a gimbal. But the way I've got it balanced means I can't move it into the completely streamlined position in order to lock them in place. And I would have to unbalance the gimbal in order to get it in its smallest form factor and put the locks on as you probably would want them locked. So I'm just not going to bother using that. But it is a feature that's there. It looks really good on the surface, but I'm not sure how practical it is given the limitations of where it can get into that streamlined position for. So overall, first impressions, there are quite a few negatives there, and this might have came across as quite a negative review, but the biggest one, as I said, is the small form factor, that it doesn't take up much space at all. It's really lightweight as well, especially compared to my previous rig setup, and that for me are two massive benefits. And I think, although I haven't used it at a wedding yet, I think I am going to much prefer using this gimbal to the Ronin-S. And who knows, with that, I might end up using it more and getting more gimbal shots, especially when we take the couple out for their shoot. So we'll see. We'll see how my next few wedding videos go over the summer, and I'll maybe do a catch-up video part 2 to this once I've filmed a few weddings with it. Thanks for watching.